The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 23, verses 23 to 32. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Ye blind guides which strain at a gnat, and swallow a camel. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Even so ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Because ye build the tombs of the prophets and garnish the sepulchres of the righteous, and say, If we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Wherefore ye be witnesses unto yourselves, that ye are the children of them which killed the prophets. Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. As we have remarked in the last two readings, chapter 23 is unique to the Gospel of Matthew as a lengthy description of the final denunciation of the religious elite by Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem in Holy Week on the Tuesday. And as far as the Gospel of Matthew, this is essentially the last words that Jesus is uttering in the temple. Now, in yesterday's reading, we covered the first 4 of 8 denunciations of the Pharisees, beginning with the phrase, Woe unto you. And as a side remark, I did point out yesterday, and it's worth remembering today, that in some translations from the Greek, the meaning would be more along the lines of woe for you. So not that bad things should come unto you, but that bad things will come unto you, and we have sorrow for you because of the end that is in sight for you. But there are these 8 denunciations which in some sense are a bookend, at the other end of which are the 8 blessings and the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus as represented in the Gospel of Matthew, occurring outside of Capernaum and covered in Matthew's chapters 5, 6 and 7. The first 4 denunciations that we covered in yesterday's reading, just to very quickly summarize them. The first one was that they were closing the kingdom of heaven against others, namely forbidding others to follow the gospel, that they took advantage of the vulnerable and weak in the use of the phrase devour widows' houses, that they went to great extremes to make proselytes, but did not then religiously instruct those new converts to Judaism, and the fourth one being that they misunderstood the nature of swearing oaths regarding the temple and the altar, but were focusing instead of the temple and the altar on the gold in the temple and the sacrifice on the altar. We continue today then in this reading with the remaining 4 denunciations, and in verses 23 and 24 Jesus is speaking about the focus of the Pharisees on details of tithes, taking tithes to an extreme limit in terms of detailed rituals and customs within Judaism, but then because of that taking their eyes off the weightier matters of the law, namely judgment, mercy and faith. So this is really just, again, the phrase we used yesterday, not seeing the wood for the trees, focusing on details and not understanding the purpose and the quality of the activity of nurturing and strengthening the relationship between man and God. A tithe is literally 1/10 of produce, and in the times particularly of Moses, valuable goods such as corn and oil and wine, 1/10 was to be set aside for the priesthood, for the Levites, and over the many centuries these tithes have become more and more detailed, and so Jesus here is giving examples of even making tithes of common herbs like mint, anise and cumin, which would be growing easily in people's gardens, but that 1/10 should be harvested for the priesthood. So focusing on extreme detail in religious custom, but then taking their eyes off the things that actually have substance and really are pivotal: judgment, mercy and faith. And these should have been the focus, along with a practice of religious custom. So Jesus is not necessarily criticizing the custom of tithes. He's making an extreme case here, talking about herbs, but tithes in general he's not criticizing, but just that they cannot be given priority over the substance of the religious law of judgment, mercy and faith. And he uses a metaphor in verse 24 to sort of highlight this, using the word blind, and he uses the word blind over and over again here. Straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel, and this refers to the practice in the Middle East of straining wine before it was drunk, because there would be fruit flies and other small flying insects that would get into the wine, make it unpleasant to drink, so the wine would be strained to remove something like a small flying insect like a gnat. So they're taking all this care to strain the wine, but they're swallowing a camel, which is another unclean creature, of course gigantic in size. So again, an extreme metaphor to make the point. Very much this one reminiscent of the speck in your brother's eye while there's a beam in your own. The next enunciation here, the 6th, speaks of the appearances, making sure that things appear clean, whereas inside there is uncleanness. So the custom that we've seen before referred to of cleaning brass vessels and cups and platters before they're used, and Jesus and his disciples being criticized for the Pharisees for not washing their hands and not washing vessels. And we remember Jesus speaking to the multitude that you will not be defiled by what goes in your mouth, you'll be defiled by what comes out of your mouth. That beautiful metaphor speaking about the fact that things that go into your mouth go into your stomach and pass out in the draught, in the language of the King James Version, whereas things that come out of your mouth come from your heart, and that's where all of the imperfections turn into wickedness from our heart through essentially our spoken word or evil thoughts and such. So the heart is where uncleanness is, and we shouldn't be too concerned about the stomach. And so he's using this example again here to speak about all of this care for appearances, but either ignoring the reality of what's on the inside, or even just being quite comfortable with the inside being very unclean. And he gives examples here of extortion and excess, so essentially extorting wealth, money or privilege from others and living in a greedy and excessive way. And again using the word blind here. You blind Pharisee, cleanse first that is which within, and the outside will be clean also. If you make the inside clean, so if you make your actions and your moral compass for the priesthood clean, it will naturally be clean on the outside. It won't require a special effort to make it look clean. Verses 27 and 28 is more of a generic denunciation of pure hypocrisy, and just the example of tombs, so sepulchres where people would be buried within the rocks, and a custom of painting them with whitewash to make them less ugly, essentially, so a whitewashed tomb could have a certain attraction to it, but also just to warn people that there are decaying bodies inside, so people should not venture in to those particular caves. So making something appear beautiful on the outside, but on the inside full of uncleanness. And he just has a generic denunciation here that you appear outwardly righteous, but within you are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. From the tone of this denunciation, these final denunciations, we see that this was one of the most sincerely felt and core issues that Jesus tried to address in his ministry. And I think it's because, yes, man was far from God, but there was this entire religion constructed with very sophisticated laws to allow religious observance and people trained in those laws. But the problem was that the religious elite had become ineffective because it was just focusing first of all on details, but also was blind to the need of people around them. And this is a generic statement. Of course, there would be many exceptions, but the general culture of the Pharisaic and the Sadducees and the Herodians was one where ordinary people were being neglected, and this was so intolerable to Jesus, who was so full of love and compassion for everyone, particularly those without power, those at the bottom of the ladder. I think it just filled him with true sorrow and anger that this inequality existed despite the fact that there was a sophisticated framework within which, in principle, it could have been ameliorated. And so those with their hands on the controls, the Pharisees and the priests and the elders, who could have created a far more equitable and harmonious society, had failed to do so because of failure, hypocrisy, iniquity, and so on. And that explains the tenor of the language in this final speech in the temple. And the eighth and final denunciation regards the hypocrisy of looking to the past at the many prophets who had tried to set Jerusalem and set Israel back on the right path, who had been stoned or beaten or killed by the established powers, often would be the priesthood or the political regal leaders of the time. So here the Pharisees in the day of Jesus, garnishing the sepulchres of the prophets and building tombs in honor of the prophets, and saying that had they been in charge in those days, they would not have shed the blood of the prophets. If we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. But Jesus saying, you are a witness to your own iniquity, that you are admitting to be the children of the murderers of the prophets, and you will repeat the acts of your fathers. Fill you up then the measure of your fathers, because Jesus knows what's coming. He will be another one who is gotten rid of because of his unpopular message of love and mercy and charity, inclusion. And not just Jesus, but he knows that those that live the gospel and promulgate the gospel particularly in those early years, there will be many martyrs and many people who are savagely treated by the Jewish elite. And we see that in the book of Acts that follows the Gospel of Luke, where very quickly there are martyrs. And we also learn in great detail about the evangelism of Paul the Apostle, who was a very courageous man who suffered many hardships and many beatings and was imprisoned many times, often by at the request of Jewish leaders, even in foreign lands, because he, in their words, was stirring up trouble, namely bringing this revolutionary message of the gospel. So indeed, these words of Jesus being very prophetic here in this final denunciation. And so we will have one more reading from this plaintive and very emotional final speech in the temple to close out chapter 23 tomorrow.